mean, I was not wrong when I said all the Frasers are tall. They really are. The whole village hall was full of these immense people. But anyway, he came up, to greet me and so forth, and said politely that, he hadn't yet managed to read my books, but, he'd heard about them and was kind of inquiring about their genesis and, how I came to write these books and so forth. And I said, well, I can tell you, but it's silly. Anyway, bear in mind that I'm 5'2", and there's this 7 foot tall, extremely good-looking man in complete Highland costume and so forth. So I'm telling him about the appeal of a man in a kilt while speaking directly into his forehead. Very embarrassing. Anyway, I mean, there's a reason why I write long books. It's because I like digressions. Yeah. Anyway, what I'm about to tell you is not actually a digression, even though it sounds like one. I'd mentioned writing for the computer press and all that. Well, one day, sometime after I had begun writing, it was before I began writing the book, I had got a package from Byte magazine, which contained a software package that they wanted reviewed, and also a trial membership to CompuServe. Now, this was the mid-'80s by this time. It was a long time before AOL or chat rooms or the World Wide Web as we know it. But there were these information services, which are bulletin board services, but they supported various special interest groups. And Byte said, well, these people have a special support forum for this software on this service, and they'd like you to join up and mention their support group in your review. I said, okay, fine. So I did that. Well, then I had 4 hours of free Connect time left, and this was back in the day when they charged you $30 an hour to be connected. I said, well, I'm not wasting $120. What else is in here? So I began poking around to see what was available, and I stumbled into a group of people called the Literary Forum. Well, now these are people who like books. It wasn't a writers group as such, so there were writers there. There were some professional writers, the first I'd ever met, some aspiring ones, but mostly just a lot of people who read books and liked to talk about them. Well, for someone with 2 full-time jobs and 3 small children, it was the ideal social life. So I joined up and began hanging around there. Well, I'd been on CompuServe for about a year when I decided to write a book myself. And I was not going to tell these people what I was doing either, because I'd often seen people come in and say, oh, I'm going to write a book about this, and talk about it, and all they would do is talk. They'd never write anything. And I said, well, I'm not going to say a word until I've actually written something, and then we'll see if I want to tell anybody about it. So I didn't. But about 6 months into the process of writing, I found myself working late one night and having an argument with a man online about what it feels like to be pregnant. And he said, oh, I know what that's like. My wife's had 3 children. I laughed. I said, yeah, Buster, I've had 3 children. He said, well, can you tell me what it's like? I said, I can, but it's rather complex. I don't know that I can explain it in a 30-line message slot. I said, I tell you what, though. I have this thing that I wrote a few months ago in which a young woman tells her brother in some detail what it's like to be pregnant. I said, I'll put that in the library here and you can read it. So I did, and everyone who'd been following the argument went and read this piece. And they all came rushing back and they said, this is great, what is it? And I said, I don't know. And they said, well, where's the beginning? And I said, I haven't written that yet. And they said, well, put up some more of it. This is fascinating. So I don't write with an outline, and I don't write in a straight line. I write in bits and pieces where I can see things happening, and then they gradually kind of join up. And so I don't actually have chapters until the last thing before I send a manuscript to my editor. And so all I had were scenes, and disconnected scenes at that. But whenever I had 5 or 10 pages that would stand more or less alone without much explanation, I'd put it up in the library. Well, people kept reading these, and they'd say, oh, Diana has a new chunk, have you read it yet? And they'd all go read it, talk about it. And they began saying, they said, cool, you should try and publish it. And I said, well, I don't even know what kind of book it is at this point. But, eventually I want to write a book that I should publish. Because originally, it was a perfectly straightforward historical novel. And when I decided on Scotland in the 18th century, I went immediately to the library to look up Scotland in the 18th century. Well, the only thing I knew about writing novels was that they should have conflict. And so I was looking quickly for overviews of Scottish history and conflict in the 18th century. Well, you don't do that for very long before you run smack into Bonnie Prince Charlie and the Jacobite Rising of the 45. So I said, well, that looks like conflict, all right. Yeah, we'll use that, fine. When I said, well, we must have a lot of Scotsmen, of course, because of the kilt factor. But I think it would be a good idea if I had a female character to play off these guys, and we'll have sexual tension, that's conflict, that's good. I said, so, okay, well, since we have Scots versus English, if I make her an English woman, we will have lots of conflict. And so on the 3rd day of writing, I introduced this English woman. Had no idea who she was, what she was doing in the story, or how she got into the plot. But I loosed her into a cottage full of Scotsmen to see what she'd do. Well, there were a bunch of them buttering by the hearth, and when she walked in, they all turned around and stared at her. And I'm saying, why, what's wrong? Does she look funny? What's going on here? Anyway, one of them rose slowly to his feet, and he said, my name is Dougal Mackenzie. Who might you be? And without my stopping to think, I just typed, "My name's Claire Elizabeth Beecham, and who the hell are you?" And I said, "Well, you don't sound at all like an 18th century person." So I fought with her for several pages, trying to beat her into shape and make her talk like a historical person, but she wasn't having any of this. She just kept making smart-ass modern remarks, and she also took over and started telling the story herself. And I said, "Well, I'm not going to fight with you all the way through this book." I said, "No one's ever going to see this. It doesn't matter what bizarre thing I do." I said, "Go ahead and be modern, and I'll figure out how you got there later." So it's all her fault that there's time travel in these books. Anyway, once you have made the decision that your main character and your main narrator is in fact a time traveler, obviously anything goes. And so by the time people were urging me to publish this book, we have not only had time travel, but the Loch Ness Monster and a lot of other improbable things. And I said, this book really has no genre, or else it has all of them, but I don't think you can sell a book under those circumstances. However, eventually I'm going to write a book I want to publish. So, what should I do? Well, I knew a lot of published writers by this time, and they were all very kind about sharing stories about their agents and all that, because they all said to a person, get a literary agent. They said an agent can do two things for you. An agent can get your manuscript read much more quickly than you can if you're just sending it in over the transom. And if it does sell, the agent can negotiate a much better contract for you than you could do yourself. And I said, well, that makes sense. How would I find an agent? And they said, well, different ways. And they told me all the different ways, one of which was talk to people who have agents. And I said, that seems the simplest, we'll do that. So whenever I found myself in conversation with a published writer, I'd ask him or her, well, do you have an agent? If you do, is it the same one you had when you started? If it's not, why not? If you write more than one kind of thing, do you have more than one kind of agent? How many different agents have you had? Do you change them like underwear, or do you do the same one for a long time? How much do you pay them, if you don't mind my asking? Is it worth it? And so forth. And they were very kind, as I say, about sharing information and advice. Well, I'd been doing my own research as well, and I began to zero in on this one gentleman, whom I'd heard about from several of them, named Perry Knowlton. Now, he was a very well-known agent, represented a lot of best-selling authors, including a couple that I knew from CompuServe, and I'd learned that he was not afraid of unorthodox books or of very long books, both of which it had dawned on me I had. And so I thought he might be a good match, but I didn't know how to approach him because he didn't take unsolicited queries. And so I said, well, I'm not finished writing the book anyway, I'll just go on asking questions. Either I will find out how to approach him, or I'll find another agent who's easier to get at. So I just went on asking questions. And 2 months later, I was talking to John Stith, a friend of mine who writes science fiction mysteries. And I said, well, I'm asking everybody about agents. John, do you have one? And he said, well, I do, yeah. His name is Perry Knowlton, by the same as so-and-so's. And he said, I know you're almost ready to look for an agent yourself. Would you like me to introduce you to Perry? And I said, well, yes, John, that would be nice. And so I was afraid John would leave CompuServe or be run over by a bus before I finished the book. So I said, yes, go ahead, ask him. Well, now, Perry was a much older gentleman, who, no longer with us, alas, who I'm sure never touched a computer in his life, so he knew nothing about CompuServe or anything. But John just wrote him an ordinary note saying, well, I know this woman, and, and I've seen some of her writing, and everybody seems to like it, and she's funny, and I think she's worth looking at. So I followed that with my own query letter, and I said, dear Mr. Knowlton, I've been writing and selling nonfiction by myself for several years now. But now that I'm writing a novel, I understand that I really need good literary representation, and you've been recommended to me by John and Judy and all these people whose opinions I respect. I said, I have this very long historical novel. I don't want to waste your time. Would you be willing to read excerpts from it? I didn't tell him I wasn't finished writing the book. Excerpts were all I had. And so he kindly called back and said, sure, he'd read my excerpts. So I hastily wrote a 26-page synopsis and gave it to him along with my excerpts, and he took me on the basis of an unfinished first novel, which was pretty good. Well, I told him when I gave him I finished the manuscript 6 months later, and when I called to tell him I was sending it, I mentioned that I would actually be in New York myself a week later for a scientific conference, and he said, oh great, come up to the office and we can meet, because we'd never met face to face, it was just all over the phone. So I did, in some trepidation of mind, because at this point Perry was the only person in the world who'd read the book, besides me, and I didn't yet know what he thought about it. So he turned out to be, as I say, a charming older gentleman who took me back to his office, got me a Diet Coke, and was trying to put me at ease by chatting about his other clients. It didn't quite have the effect he hoped, because it was at this point that I realized that in addition to the people I knew from CompuServe, he also represented Tony Hillerman, Frederick Forsyth, and Robertson Davies.